Hey all, this is Brown at I Have Brown, and today we're going to be talking about Essential X-Men, Volume 2. So this collection of black and white reprints contains issues 120 through 144 of the X-Men series, as written by Chris Claremont and illustrated by John Byrne, with at least one issue being guest illustrated by Brent Anderson. So this represented a point in the series where everyone was firing on all cylinders, both within the book and outside of the book. Outside of the book, the creative team was working together to craft stories that would go on to, stand the test of time and be regarded as, classics that's, are still regarded as so to this day. And they also went on to gradually develop the characters that are introduced in Volume 1 and make them into, ones that would eventually become fan favorites. Within the book, this represents a point where the X-Men have genuinely gone from, stubborn individuals to individuals who are able to work together as a team and work together efficiently. So it's definitely an area of growth for sure. But before I get into the stories collected here, I think, if I remember correctly, I don't know if I went into a whole lot of detail as to what the abilities of the X-Men were. So real quick, I'll just go ahead and do that. But you have Scott Summers, aka Cyclops, who has these optic blasts that he's able to emit from his eyes, and he's honed them to near perfection, with his years of training as, one of the leaders of the X-Men. But unfortunately, he has to, keep his eyes covered at all times, primarily by a ruby quartz lens. Otherwise, if he opens his eyes without anything covering them, then whatever's in front of him is destroyed by his optic blasts. And so you also have Jean Grey, who at one point went by the name of Marvel Girl, or the code name of Marvel Girl, but as of late has been going by the name of Phoenix, what with her having become host of the Phoenix entity over in Volume 1. And so initially, prior to her becoming the host of the Phoenix entity, her initial abilities were telepathy and telekinesis. She was able to read minds, communicate telepathically, and also able to, move stuff, with the power of her mind, as in without touching anything. She can move, touching something, she can move it. And much like Scott Summers, with her, the amount of time she spent as a member of the X-Men, she was able to hone her natural abilities to near perfection. But with her being the host of the Phoenix entity, she has gained an increase in her abilities. And one of the sources of friction within the stories of this book is that there seems to be, no end to her level of power, which is something that on one hand, makes her a force to be reckoned with in a combat situation, but also it makes her a source of, dread and horror, because, we don't know how much power is too much power. But you also have the character of, Logan, who goes by a code name of Wolverine, and he's a Canadian mutant who has a regenerative healing ability, which allows him to recover from grievous wounds. And he also has an enhanced olfactory sense, or he has enhanced olfactory senses, which makes him an excellent tracker in the field. But at some point, someone had kidnapped him and experimented on him and grafted a metal called adamantium to his skeleton. And amongst other things, he now has these metal claws that, come out of his hands, courtesy of these metal ports that were grafted to his hands. And so, he's one tough cookie who is, if not impossible to kill, at least very hard to kill. And also you factor into all this, the little detail that, he's already, got a great deal of combat training, with his, time as a member of the Canadian military in the past. So Wolverine, one tough cookie. You also have Aurora Monroe, who an African mutant who goes by the codename of Storm, and as her name would suggest, she has the ability to control the weather, and this makes her one of the most powerful members of the team. And she also has a nurturing, side to her, and acts as, sort of a big sister and semi-mother figure of the team. But she also has a near crippling sense of claustrophobia, and so, going from the stories, in Volume 1 onward, it's something that she struggled with for quite some time, and it's a factor, that oftentimes affects her in combat, but she is working to, get better and, cope with it. But you also have the character of Peter Rasputin, a Russian mutant who has the ability to turn his body into, organic steel. So, he's flesh and blood one minute, but if he's in a crisis or combat situation, he can will his body to change into an organic steel version of himself, which makes him one of the strongest members of the team, because he's able to take a lot of damage, and he's also able to do a lot of damage. And then you have Kurt Wagner, who goes by a codename of Nightcrawler, and he looks like a demon or a goblin, but he's one of the most kind-hearted members of the team, along with Peter Rasputin. And that's, another source of irony is that Peter Rasputin, as Colossus, is one of the strongest members of the team, but he's also one of the most compassionate members of the team. So him and Nightcrawler both, make up for some rather interesting contradictions. In Nightcrawler's case, he looks like a demon, but he's one of the most selfless members of the team, and also one of the most jovial as well. And, along with looking like a monster, his body's, the way his body is made, or was designed, I guess, how he was born, he's a natural athlete, but he also has the ability to teleport and blend into the shadows as well. And so a rather fascinating set of powers. And he's gotten to where, teleportation, he does have limits to how much he can do. Like, if he's teleporting by himself, it's, little no problem. But if he's trying to teleport himself and someone else, it takes a bit more of an effort. And if he's trying to teleport, say, a great distance, whether by himself or with someone else, it's a real struggle for him. But you also have the character of Sean Cassidy, who goes by a codename of Banshee, and he has the ability to emit a sonic scream, which not only does a lot of damage in combat, but he's able to basically ride that sonic scream and use the energy from that to fly. And so he also has the advantage of having had prior training as a police officer, prior to joining the X-Men, which makes him a rather resourceful individual. But you also have Professor Xavier, or his nickname sometimes is Professor X, or I guess you could say Professor Charles Xavier if you want to, have the full name. But he's physically one of the weakest members of the team, due to having had his legs crushed in an incident a long time ago. But he's also one of the most powerful members of the team in the sense of his telepathy, because he's able to read minds and communicate telepathically, but he's also able to wipe someone's mind or, take control of someone if he wants to or he feels he has to. And he's also able to project himself onto the astral plane, and which is kind of like a playground / battleground for telepaths. But so you have this group of individuals who have a fascinating set of powers, but because of their individual flaws as characters, they're having to sort of, there's this like check and there's like a sense of having checks and balances here. I mean, these people have natural abilities that are, fascinating and cool, but they're also having to contend with, say, their own inner demons, or say their own physical limitations as well. So, yeah, I mean, fascinating source of, power, with a good group of characters. But okay, so now that we've got introductions out of the way here, another thing I was gonna say is if you haven't done so, you might want to check out my review of Essential X-Men Volume 1, so that way you can get caught up as to what's going on here. And there might be a couple of references to some of the stories from Volume 1. But or if you want to check out Essential X-Men Volume 1, or like say find it at a bookstore or find it online, I'd highly recommend doing so. Because it's a good starting point for say new X-Men readers. And plus it leads into Volume 2 rather naturally. So, okay, so as to the stories in here, we start off with the first 2 issues in this volume introducing us to the Canadian super team Alpha Flight, which is actually a team that Wolverine was a part of prior to having joined the X-Men. And so Alpha Flight is led by a character named Guardian, whose real name is James MacDonald Hudson, who, along with his wife Heather, had befriended Wolverine a long time ago. And at some point, whenever he had escaped from whoever had abducted him and experimented on him, he had been found in the woods and, malnourished and everything. And James and his wife Heather had nursed him back to health and worked to restore his humanity, and so when the Canadian government found out that James had this individual under his care, they realized that hey, this is someone we could use, because he's a mutant with healing abilities and olfactory senses that make him an excellent tracker, but he also has this adamantium skeleton bonded to him, and so they didn't really care that it wasn't something that he had wanted done to him, and they don't care that he doesn't know who did it to him. They just want him to be a part of the team that James had been trying to put together. And so when Wolverine had jumped ship, when Professor Xavier came to Canada back in Volume 1 looking for mutants to help save the original X-Men, Wolverine basically embraced the opportunity to kind of be his own man on a team that allowed for more individualism, in the sense that it wasn't, say, a government-sanctioned super team. But, the Canadian government, never forgave him for that. And so back in Volume 1, James, initially going by the codename of Weapon Alpha, had used this suit, that was based on some designs by Reed Richards, amongst other people. And this suit had given him the abilities in combat of enhanced strength, as well as flight and some form of combat shielding, energy shielding. And so he had tried to retrieve Wolverine by himself back in Volume 1 at one point, but the X-Men ended up driving him off. But he was alluding to the idea of bringing the whole team of Alpha Flight with him next time. And so this time, that comes to fruition. And so we're introduced to this new Canadian super team, wherein you have the characters of Michael Two Young Men, who goes by the name of Shaman, who is a Native American sorcerer, and who not only is skilled in, the arts of sorcery of his tribe, but he also has a magical medicine bag, and wherein he's able to reach in and retrieve, objects of power, to help the team in a crisis or combat situation. And you also have Snowbird, who is an individual who's partially inhuman, in a sense that one of her parents, was human, one of them wasn't, but she has the ability to fly, as well as the ability to turn into any, form of animal that lives on Canadian soil, or any animal that is a part of the Canadian landscape, I guess you could say, both whether it be say more real animals or mythological animals. And so you also have Northstar and Aurora, who are brother and sister, and they're gifted with the ability of super speed, which comes in handy with their ability to fly. But they also are able to, by coming together, like say with a high five or something like that, they're able to emit a burst of light which blinds their enemies. And you also have Walter Langowski, who goes by the codename of Sasquatch, and he was a former football player who ended up becoming a scientist in the area of gamma radiation, and much akin to Bruce Banner, turning into the Incredible Hulk. Langowski is able to turn himself into a Sasquatch, but unlike Bruce turning into the Hulk and not being able to retain his human intellect, or Langowski, when he turns into Sasquatch, he's able to maintain his intellect while having the natural ability of the Sasquatch. And so so you have this fascinating group of individuals here working together to try and get Wolverine back not only into the Canadian government but back onto their team as well. And so they had initially, because at this point the X-Men they were leaving Japan, and in mid-flight the Alpha Flight team had basically manipulated the weather, courtesy of Shaman, into, say, working against the X-Men's flight and forcing them to come down in Canada. And so once that happens, the Alpha Flight hits them, and they end up kidnapping both Wolverine and Nightcrawler. And so the X-Men, they work to try and free their comrades, but at that point, Wolverine had had enough, and he's like, okay, hey guys, stop. This is all because of me. I'm not going to be responsible for any more bloodshed here. I'll turn myself in. And so as a result, of himself of him giving himself up, Alpha Flight releases Nightcrawler to the X-Men and allows the X-Men to leave Canada, via a safe escort by the Canadian Air Force. And so the X-Men, once they're out of Canadian airspace, are wanting to go back to Canada and try and rescue Wolverine, contrary to what Wolverine was telling them. But it turns out that Wolverine had already snuck out of the transport he was in and had somehow gotten onto the plane before the X-Men had gotten on as well. And so at this point Wolverine's like, look, this is something I'm going to have to take care of at some point in the very near future, but guys, I'm with you all the way. And so his connection and bond with the X-Men at this point is further solidified, and Alpha Flight is a team that we will definitely see again in the very near future. But following that, you have a story wherein Storm is finding out what it's like to live in New York at the time, because it turns out that while she had grown up in Cairo and Kenya, she remembers that her mom and dad had once lived in New York, and so she remembers it being described as kind of like this urban paradise almost at the time. But now it's a slum, because this was like the late 70s, early 80s. And so she's seeing what life is like over there, and she runs afoul of a street gang that is making like this derelict building kind of a crash pad. And she very nearly gets killed by them, courtesy of one of them slashing her with a knife. And she's a formidable individual by herself, both with her powers and her combat training, but there's just too many of them. But courtesy of the timely intervention of Luke Cage, who happened to be working with Misty Knight at the time, who was a friend of the X-Men, they're able to, get Storm out of there and get her to the hospital and get her hand patched up. But it's a rather sobering, encounter, with, street life. And Storm's reminded in some ways of her life as a child on the streets of Cairo as a thief of all this. But, she was rather disheartened to see, how bad things are in America, where, things are supposed to be, better, than, say, a third world country. But following that, you have the character of Arcade coming, onto the scene. And Arcade is an individual who acts as a mercenary by way of having, used his, financial resources, to create this place called Murder World, which on the surface looks like a carnival, but it's actually uses a series of carnival-like death traps, to capture and kill, people that, clients pay, to have kidnapped or killed. And in this case, the villains, Black Tom Cassidy and Juggernaut, due to having, been defeated by the X-Men in Volume 1, paid Arcade to have the X-Men and some of their loved ones kidnapped and put into Arcade's death traps. And so Arcade, ends up successfully having the X-Men and some of their loved ones kidnapped. And, thankfully, though, Spider-Man, of all people, stumbles upon this. And due to having had some prior experience fighting Arcade, he's able to put two and two together and help save them. And so, the X-Men, initially, when they're, at Murder World, I mean, they're sort of cut off from one another, and they're in their own individual death traps, but, basically, they're all able to, use their training to make their way, through Murder World and, come together and find the area where their loved ones are being held. And at that point, Arcade ends up kicking them out of Murder World, courtesy of, some comical-looking mechanisms. But after having done so, he sends them a letter, basically, congratulating them on surviving his death traps, this time. But next round, he's going to be the victor. And, so, the X-Men and Spider-Man, they part ways amicably and everything, because at this point, they're definitely friends and allies in their careers. But following that, lighthearted story, you have a part of the book wherein things take on a much darker turn, and this leads into the Proteus saga, and which in turn takes place on Muir Island, where Moira McTaggart lives. And Moira McTaggart was the former girlfriend of Professor Xavier, and the two of them had worked together to research mutant, the natural abilities of mutants, like, say, what made a mutant, or how can we make it to where a mutant's potentially dangerous abilities are more controllable by the individual and what have you, like various areas of research. And so they end up having to go to Muir Island, though, and at this point in the story, they're actually reunited with Jean Grey, because up until this point, the X-Men were kind of split off into two groups. I mean, you had Jean Grey and Beast, aka Hank McCoy, who, while he hadn't been a member of the X-Men at the time, had actually taken a leave of absence from the Avengers that he was a part of, and had helped the X-Men out on a particular adventure wherein they ran afoul of Magneto. But in said adventure, which was taking place under Magneto's base, and which was a part of a volcano, there was a lava flow that ended up separating the X-Men from one another. So you had the rest of the X-Men, going one way, and you had Jean and Beast, being, forced to go another. And so both groups thought that the other was dead. And Professor Xavier had also thought that the X-Men were dead as well. and as a result, he ended up leaving Earth to spend time with his alien girlfriend, Lilandra, when we met back in Volume 1. And so, with this Mirror Island adventure, though, the teams reunited with one another, and you have Alex Summers, aka Havoc, and you have Lorna Dane, aka Polaris, former members of the X-Men team, being reunited with Scott Summers and the other X-Men. And Scott, of course, is beyond happy to see Jean, and vice versa. Because at this point, there was kind of like there had been a budding romance, between them. And so when they all thought the other dead, I mean, it was a rather, heartbreaking, time for them. But now that they know that the other's alive, they're like, hey, let's, try and renew things. But you also have on the island a character named Jamie Madrox, called the Multiple Man, because he's able to make duplicates of himself. And he had been working with Myra McTaggart, in her area of research as well, along with Havoc and Polaris. But the reason they're on the island, though, is that there in the surrounding area, there had been a series of murders wherein, bodies were popping up, that had been, desiccated and withered down to where there were husks. And, Moira, she's able to put two and two together and after finding out that a certain containment chamber was no longer secure, she realized that the subject that she had given the name the codenamed Mutant X to, had escaped. And so Mutant X, it turns out, is her son Kevin. And Kevin, in turn, was basically the product of rape, it turns out. Because after she had broken up with Charles Xavier, she had met this, politician who, had, I guess, was superficially charming and everything, and he was very ambitious, but he was also a very cruel individual. And, when he and Moira were parting ways, he basically, sent her to the hospital. And in the process, he had gotten her pregnant as well. And so, the story touches on a rather dark subject in the sense of, this piece of crap having, raped Moira. But, Kevin was basically the product of that union. But, he was also born with, a terrifying ability to warp reality. And so for his own protection and for the world's protection, Moira had kept him in this containment chamber for, most of his life. But unfortunately, due to a battle in Volume 1 having taken place on Muir Island, wherein the X-Men had fought Magneto, the containment chamber had been compromised. And so Kevin had, at this point, himself been reduced to kind of a withered husk, but he was able to escape by taking possession of, someone who was coming to the island to snoop around. And so, and it turns out that, Kevin is able to body hop, like he's able to, send himself into someone else's body and take control of them, and whatever body he departs from is left as a withered husk, because that's when he's basically used up all that body's energy. And so you have a body-hopping mutant who's able to warp reality around him, and he also has this overwhelming desire to kill his own father, because he was able to pick up on the hatred that Moira has for his father. And so, and so he has this sort of love-hate thing going with Moira, because he loves her because she's his mother, but he hates her because of how she's kept him confined all these years. And so he makes his way to his father and ends up, taking possession of him. But it turns out that his father, is such an evil man that while Kevin's will, overrides his, the residual evil that was, a part of, the evil that was a part of his father stays with him. and basically, sort of goes hand in hand, with his unstable mental nature, as in Kevin's unstable mental nature. And so basically, he's possessing his own father, and he's got this overwhelming desire to hurt his mother, because he's, seeing the memories of, how his father saw his mother, and how she was just, something to break and toy with. And so it's a rather terrifying situation, because here he is, at this point, after having, taken control of his own father, he's taunting, his own mother and tormenting her. And then he's also, turning the world upside down around him. And the X-Men at this point have already tried to fight him. And unfortunately, his abilities were just so powerful that he just devastated them. But he does have a weakness, though: metal. If he's hit by something, or if he tries to make contact with something with metal, it hurts him. And so, like, he can control metal, but he can't, say, become a part of it. So at one point, like, he had tried to possess Wolverine, but because of Wolverine's adamantium skeleton, he ended up getting out of Wolverine's body, or retreating from Wolverine's body, screaming. And so the best that the X-Men can do is basically, repeat these hit-and-run tactics against him. And after some improvised coaching from Cyclops, they're able to get over the mental trauma of having, gone up against a mutant who had basically, warped their version of reality and turned, their senses upside down. And so after having, some further, coaching from Cyclops, the X-Men were able to, work together, as a team with these hit-and-run tactics to, keep on, weakening Kevin's, host body. And so finally, when his body's, basically taken too much damage, he's forced to vacate it. And at that point, he's in his, natural energy state. And it's Colossus, of all people, who deals the killing blow. And because of his pure metal body, this is something that, disperses, Kevin's energy form to the four winds. And they're able to confirm that, Kevin is dead. And so it was a victory, but a costly one, because, a lot of people were killed. And also, there's a lot of mental trauma as well. And then, of course, there's the fact that this was Moira McTaggart's son. And she was put in a position where she had tried to kill her own son, for the sake of, her friends and loved ones, as well as humanity in general. Because, had Kevin kept on going, his powers were increasing the more he used them. And, thus, how he was able to, maintain his grip on, the body of his father much longer than, say, the other host bodies he had used. And so, a very terrifying foe. But this, in turn, leads into the Dark Phoenix saga. And so, as that particular story, starts off, we have Banshee, Sean Cassidy, taking a leave of absence from the team for a couple of reasons. One, he had been injured, back in Volume 1, courtesy of having overextended his sonic screaming ability in one particular mission, to a point where his vocal cords had been torn. And so, while he was still a part of the team, he was able to help him out with, say, like mechanical stuff and training and what have you. In the field, he was unable to, adequately help them, because, oftentimes they were going up against superpowered foes. And, when he's deprived of his power, he can't really do anything. To fight, like, say, like, he can't use his, ability to help the X-Men out. And so he was already, questioning, his place on the team. Like, he was starting to feel like a fifth wheel. But he'd also had a burgeoning romance with Moira McTaggart. And so, after the tragic outcome of the Proteus saga, Sean decides to stay behind on Muir Island and not only help Moira and Jamie and Alex and Lorna with their experiments, but also, to stay behind and help her out and, comfort her, because, she's experienced, a tremendous loss, and he's someone who's experienced loss in the past as well. And so, he's wanting to help her out, because he loves and cares about her. And so he says his goodbyes to the X-Men, and, he's saying, I'm hoping that my abilities will return one day, but for now, you'll have to do without me. And so, so this leads into things where we're introduced to a group called the Hellfire Club, which is a group of evil individuals, mostly consisting of mutants, that are, a shadowy organization. Like, they masquerade as this elite social club, but behind the scenes, they're pulling the strings and trying to, use their abilities and their resources to place themselves in the upper echelons of society and make it to where there's like a group of mutants who, run the show behind the scenes, within the, government. And so basically kind of, try and, destroy things from within. But these are not good guys. These are evil individuals. But it turns out that they were behind the character of Warhawk in Volume 1, having snuck into the mansion and attacked the team. And it turns out that he had left these monitoring devices that the X-Men never found out about. And these devices these surveillance devices were used to gather data on the X-Men. So over time, the Hellfire Club has amassed an expert amount of, data on, and knowledge on the X-Men and their powers and, their strengths and their weaknesses and their limits. And so what they're wanting to do, their end goal is to, basically turn Jean Grey, or aka Phoenix, over to their side, because, they see that she's, a very powerful telepath, and they know that with someone like her on their side, they'd be unstoppable, but this falls to the character of Jason Wingard, who's a master level illusionist, and he enacts a scheme to basically worm his way into Jean Grey's life and hits her with these hallucinations and visions of her, where she's convinced that she's experiencing memories of an ancestor of hers, wherein said ancestor was lovers with someone who may have been an ancestor of Jason Wingard's, and basically makes it to where she's falling more in love with him than, say, Scott Summers, or she's becoming more loyal to him and therefore the Hellfire Club than, say, the X-Men. And so they also attack the X-Men when the X-Men are trying to find these two mutants that Cerebro had discovered. You have Alison Blair, who was a singer who goes by the stage name of Dazzler, and she has the ability, as if I understand correctly, to use sound to make these psychedelic light effects, which act as, say, various forms of energy constructs. Like, she's able to use these light bursts, these sound to light bursts to disorient her enemies. And so there's like very much a psychedelic effect, whenever she uses her powers. And then you have the character of Kitty Pryde, who's a 14-year-old girl who has found that she's a mutant and has the ability to walk through objects or float through objects as well. And so the X-Men had tried to track these two individuals down, and so at the Hellfire Club, because they're thinking, okay, yes, we want to defeat the X-Men and we want Jean Grey on our side, but we also see some potential with these two individuals. And so, some of the X-Men, end up, getting soundly defeated by the Hellfire Club's forces. But then you also have some of the others being able to, work with, like, say you have Cyclops and Jean Grey, working with Dazzler, to defeat the Hellfire Club's forces. And, the group of X-Men that had gone to talk to Kitty Pryde, they're the ones who end up being captured. But Kitty Pryde ends up helping them out, because, I mean, at this point, the Hellfire Club doesn't know about her powers, and they don't know that she's, basically followed them on their transport. And so, she ultimately ends up, calling, for help, like, calling, the other X-Men and telling them what's going on. And so, they're able to, rescue the other X-Men. And in the process, though, you have the character Emma Frost, who goes by the codename of White Queen, who is a master-level telepath, who had been tormenting, the X-Men telepathically, trying to get information from them. But then, when she ends up in a battle of wills with Jean Grey, I mean, it seems evenly matched at first, but Jean basically reveals that she was just toying with her, trying to, get a level of how, her limit of power, or her limits of power. And so once she, knows enough, she basically goes all in, on Emma Frost, to the point where she nearly destroys her. And Emma Frost uses, the last ounce of strength she has to, channel like this psychic burst, which drives Jean Grey away, but puts her in a coma, which we don't find out until several issues later. But, for this point in time, Jean's thinking that, she may have killed Emma Frost, or Emma Frost may have been killed in the battle. But in the meantime, though, other members of the Hellfire Club, namely Sebastian Shaw, who's the leader of the team, and then Leland and Donald Pierce. These three guys, along with Jason Wingard, basically chalk this up as, okay, round one goes to the X-Men, round two will be, ours. And so at this point, the X-Men, they've regrouped, and they're recovering from their injuries, from the battle and everything. And so they also they talk with both Dazzler, or it's Allison Blair, aka Dazzler, and Kitty Pryde, who at this point doesn't have a code name yet because she's not a member of the team. But they approach them both as, say, with offers to be a part of the X-Men. But Dazzler, she's basically saying, hey, it was fun working with you guys, and I'm glad we were able to help each other, but the superhero thing's not for me. I'm a singer. That's what I want to do. But if you guys need my help, or if I need y'all's help, y'all give me a call, or I give you a call. So they part on good terms. And so while they don't really feel comfortable with making Kitty Pryde, say, a straight-up member of the X-Men, they're wanting her to come on as a student, so that way she can hone her abilities, and hopefully in time, if she's willing, to be a member of the team when she gets older. But when they get to Kitty Pryde's home, her parents are furious, because all they know is that there was some sort of chaos involving their daughter, and they're basically wanting to sue the X-Men, or Professor Xavier and the X-Men. But at that point, Professor X, he's at a loss for words, because out of the blue, Kitty's parents suddenly start acting very friendly to them and saying, well, we'd be more than happy to, have our daughter, be a student of your school. And at first, some of the X-Men are like, wait a minute, did Professor X just pull a whammy on Kitty's parents? And Scott's like, no, that wasn't Professor X. And, you look at him and you can see Professor X going like, what the heck just happened? And it turns out it was actually Jean Grey, using her, enhanced abilities to basically switch Kitty's parents, I guess you could say, pull a whammy on them, and make it to where they were more agreeable to Professor X and the X-Men's goals. And so, on one hand, I mean, it's a good thing in a sense that Kitty's going to have a place to come in the future to where she's going to be able to learn to use her abilities in a more refined way, but also hopefully be able to become friends with others like her. But that doesn't come until a bit later in this book. But so the X-Men, after this adventure, or this part of the Dark Phoenix saga, they regroup and they hang out with Warren Worthington, who was the former member of the Team Angel, and his girlfriend, and just kind of catch up. But Cyclops, or Scott, asks Warren if the two of them can talk in private, and so they go to this mountain where it's just the two of them, so they can talk about things. And Scott's conveying his concerns to Warren about Jean Grey, because she's becoming increasingly powerful, and there seems to be no end to her abilities at all. And he's becoming very concerned, and also it turns out that during the Proteus saga, Moira McTaggart had been doing research on Jean's abilities, and it turns out that back in Volume 1, after their adventures in Volume 1, Professor X had worked with Jean to have these sort of mental barriers in place, because he realized that, hey, this is a cosmic entity housed in a human body, and there's no telling of what it'll do if it's at full strength. And so he had these barriers put in place wherein she'd be able to, in theory, gradually become accustomed to having this cosmic entity be a part of her. But Moira had explained that at some point these barriers had been removed, and so this is something that kind of factors into the Hellfire Club plans. But Cyclops, though, at this point doesn't know for sure what's going on there. All he knows is that Jean's getting more and more powerful. And at that point, Jean was able to read his mind from however many miles away they were from each other, and she telekinetically brings herself to where Warren and Scott are, and Warren's like, I think I'll go see how my girlfriend's doing, and so takes off and leaves the two lovebirds alone for a bit. And they have a very, frank, conversation with one another about, how the team, I mean, they're grateful that, Jean's alive. And, after all, after they all thought, she was dead, but they're also unnerved about, how she just keeps on getting more and more powerful. And, she understands their concerns, but, she, saying that, regardless of what happens, I'm always going to be, with you guys. And you and I are always going to, have a connection. And so she opens up her mind and offers Scott a telepathic bond, like something that'll be permanent. So that way, they'll always be able to, talk to each other, even if they're, miles away from each other. And they'll always be a part of each other. And so Scott accepts, and so this telepathic bond, is made between the two of them. And so, this basically cements their love, as it were. And so in the meantime, though, Scott had, approached Warren about, finding out information about the Hellfire Club, because, I mean, he was trying to vent and say, hey, I don't know anything about these people, or, what their resources are. And it turns out Warren and his girlfriend are actually members of the Hellfire Club, but the social portion of the club. They didn't know anything about the shadowy part of the club, and so so they're able to use their connections to get the X-Men into, you know, one of the Hellfire Club's social parties, albeit in disguise. But it turns out that the Hellfire Club has been monitoring, you know, the X-Men, you know, ever since they came into the party. And so at this point, the X-Men are soundly defeated by the Hellfire Club as they strategically separate them and defeat them. And you have Sebastian Shaw, the leader of the Hellfire Club, who has this ability to basically absorb any sort of energy, like kinetic energy, you know, for example, and basically use it to make himself stronger. And so, for example, you have someone like Colossus who hits him, and that would ordinarily flatten someone, but this just, you know, makes Sebastian Shaw stronger, and he's able to, you know, hit Colossus with his own strength. And then you have, you know, Leland, who, you know, is a big, hefty individual, but who has the ability to increase the mass of an individual, of say, an opponent, which Wolverine finds out the hard way and basically falls into the sewers, you know, through several billion floors. So, and with his adamantium skeleton, of course, I mean, that makes him even heavier, you know. But then Donald Pierce isn't a mutant, but he's actually a cyborg. But this doesn't mean, you know, he's a pushover. In fact, he's very physically strong, very physically agile, and is able to do quite a bit of damage to his opponents. So, but the coup de grace, though, comes when Cyclops, you know, he's able to, he's separated from Jean, you know, and but he finds her, though, like partially using, you know, his bond with her to follow her, and he sees Jason Wyngarde, you know, with her, but Jason Wyngarde turns around and reveals himself to be, you know, the old X-Men foe Mastermind, who was an illusionist. And so, you know, apparently Jason Wyngarde was a persona he had made for himself whenever he joined the Hellfire Club. And then Jean Grey, you know, turns on Scott and, you know, incapacitates him with her power. And it's revealed that, you know, basically she is now, you know, the Hellfire Club's new Black Queen, and to kind of replace Emma Frost, the White Queen. And she's, you know, loyal to Hellfire Club heart and soul. And so it turns out, see, that, you know, the fact that her mental barriers had been removed, you know, that was a part of the Hellfire Club scheme. And so, you know, they were initially doing that, you know, via Jason Wyngarde's or Mastermind's, you know, trickery and machinations, you know, in order to make her more loyal to the Hellfire Club over time. You know, but what had happened was this removal of barriers, you know, not only allows for an constant increase in power, but, you know, Jason Wyngarde's tampering with Jean Grey's, you know, soul and mind, you know, has basically, you know, made her more prone to give in to her dark side and revel in it. And so, so it turns out, see, that while she was initially has become loyal to the Hellfire Club, you know, there's just enough of, you know, her bond with Cyclops to, you know, ultimately help him get free, and as a result, he's able to free the rest of the X-Men, and they're able to defeat the Hellfire Club and send them on the run. But unfortunately, though, for Jason Wyngarde, or Mastermind, who had, you know, hidden in the room in disguise as part of the wall, you know, he's basically saying, okay, I can recruit my resources, I can, you know, recover, and I can, you know, use this as something to, you know, call into question, you know, Sebastian Shaw's capability as a leader. You know, I can blame this on him. And he's, you know, trying to make these plans, but this whole time, Jean's in the room with him, and, you know, she feels sorry for him because she knows what she's about to do to him, but she is looking forward to it. And so she reveals herself and basically, reads him the riot act, and, is threatening to kill him. But then, she's telling him that, she knows that, he, as mastermind, wasn't a skilled illusionist, but nothing more. But the powers that he was displaying as Jason Wingard were on a whole other level, and she's demanding to know, how he was able to do that to her. And he admits that, it was this piece of technology that the Hellfire Club had made that had boosted his powers. And so once Jean destroys this device, she, is basically, telling Jason that, since he wants power so much, he'll now have all the power that, he wants and then some. And so basically she hits him with this ever-increasing cosmic vision of eternity, and it's something that breaks his mind, and he's left a drooling mess. And so she leaves him, and rejoins the X-Men. But once the X-Men retreat from the scene in their airplane, she basically turns into Dark Phoenix and destroys the plane and sends the X-Men plummeting to what could be their deaths, except that they're able to use their training to get to the ground safely, with some of the members being able to fly and helping the others that can't fly and what have you. And so at this point, I should mention that Beast, of all people, gets involved because he's on monitor duty at the Avengers Mansion, and he gets an alert, from a media alert, and it's a report that, the X-Men are on a rampage at the Hellfire Club. And now, naturally, the media nor the public know that the Hellfire Club was really a front for a group of evil mutants. And so Beast, he's torn between, his duty to tell the Avengers what's going on, so that way they can, say, confront the X-Men and say, hey, what's going on here? Why are you guys doing this? And then, trying to, go to his old team and figure out what's going on for himself, and if he can't help them, because he figures, okay, there's no way that the X-Men are just going on a mindless rampage here. And so he deletes the tapes, of the news alert, and goes, to join the X-Men himself. And so, the X-Men, as they're, fighting Jean, she's able to easily defeat them for the most part, but she also, is growing increasingly, hungry on, say, a cosmic level, and she leaves Earth and, flies into another star system, basically just testing her powers and everything. And she's overjoyed with what she's able to do and all. But this, massive use of energy has left her, hungry. And so she basically feeds on the sun in this star system, to a point where, it's destroyed. And as a result, the planets in the system are destroyed as well. And one of these planets is inhabited by an intelligent alien civilization. So overnight, this whole alien race is destroyed because, Jean Grey, as Dark Phoenix, was hungry. And so after this, this Shi'ar battle cruiser happens to be in the area because they saw that the star had gone nova, and they're able to use their equipment to get a closer view, and they see that it's Jean Grey as Dark Phoenix, and they send an alert to the homeworld and in turn Empress Lilandra, and tell her that they're going to engage the Dark Phoenix in battle, and warning her, but they're also warning her that what you feared would come to pass has come to pass. And so they try to destroy the Dark Phoenix, but she easily destroys the ship. But in their dying act, they were able to get through to their to the throne world and Lilandra and warn her that the Dark Phoenix has risen. And so Lilandra was terrified of something like this happening because while Jean Grey, as the Phoenix, had basically helped them save the universe back in their adventures together, the legends, were the Shi'ar legends about the Phoenix were basically saying that the Phoenix as an entity was something that could not be controlled and would constantly, be hungry, for, all life in the universe eventually. But she was hoping that, Jean Grey's, naturally benevolent influence, as well as that of the X-Men, would be able to temper the Phoenix entity. But unfortunately, as far as she doesn't know why this has happened, but this is obviously not the case. And since, Dark Phoenix has basically wiped out an alien civilization overnight, she needs to be brought to justice and, for the sake of the universe, destroyed. But in the meantime, back on, Earth, Jean Grey returns, and she makes it, to her family's home. And, her family's, naturally surprised to see her. And at first, she's happy to see them. And she doesn't know why she came, because, here she is, this cosmic entity, and yet she's acting like she's still human, but then she starts picking up on all their thoughts. Their conscious ones and their unconscious ones. And their unconscious thoughts are filled with apprehension of her because they know that there's something different about her. Like, they knew she was a mutant, but they don't know, but they know that there's something sinister going on. They can feel it. And as a result, they're scared of her. And so basically, this causes her to lash out at them. And, and she nearly kills them. But then she, senses that, the X-Men have, come to, her family's home as well. And so she goes outside to fight them. And this is where, Beast uses his intellect, to help the team, because while they were making their way, after he had hooked up with the team and they made their way to, the home of Jean's family, he had designed this contraption, like a helmet, to put on Jean, and thus, hopefully limit her abilities. And he kind of just made this on the spot, so he doesn't know for sure if it's going to work, but hopefully it'll give the X-Men a fighting chance. And so, they're able to, use these hit and run tactics on her, and they know that they're outclassed in terms of straight up power, but at the same time, they're able to distract her enough to where, Beast is able to use his acrobatics and, get over to her and get the helmet, get to the device on her head. And so this does limit her abilities, but it doesn't mean she's without her abilities. But it makes it to where, she's having to, fight like an internal mental battle while also fighting the X-Men. So basically fighting on two fronts. And Wolverine finds himself in a position where he has the chance to kill her. And, he's the most hardened member of the team. And he knows that, he doesn't know, what Jean Grey has done as the Dark Phoenix in the sense that she's wiped out an alien civilization. But he knows that this darkness, is something that can only be destroyed by death. Like, it's something, it can only end in death, whether it be, humanity's death or Jean Grey's death. And so Wolverine, he finds himself in a position where he's about to kill her, but at this last second, he can't do it, because, Dark Phoenix, for a brief moment, flickers out of existence, and it's Jean Grey, and she's, begging Wolverine to kill her, but he loves her too much, or he's come to love her, during his time as the X-Men, and he can't bring himself to do it. And that allows Dark Phoenix to resurface, within seconds, and, basically swat him aside like a fly. And she, takes off the device that, Hank McCoy, Beast, had made, and destroys it. And, she compliments the X-Men on putting up a good fight, or making a good effort, but, their fates are sealed. And she had initially spared them in the first fight, as basically out of respect for, their friendship with Jean Grey, or who she used to be. But now there'll be no mercy. But then, Scott puts his life on the line. He just basically, says, okay, if Jean Grey, the woman I know and love, is really dead, then kill me. And he's telling Phoenix, he's telling Dark Phoenix, I mean, he's telling her, kill me, prove that, that there's no humanity left in you, prove that there's no love left in you. And she's finding that she can't. And she's saying, I don't need to prove anything to you. And he's saying, but you're all powerful. I mean, you could do whatever you want. So why can't you just kill me? I mean, if you're really, devoid of, heart and soul, why not do it? And she's struggling to find a reason, because it's like she's wanting to kill him, but at the same time she can't kill him. And Scott's, telling her, I think it's because you and the Dark Phoenix, you're one and the same, and yet you're separate from one another. Jean's a part of you, and you're a part of Jean. And, basically, that's why, you held back, when you fought us. I mean, you defeated us, but you didn't kill us, even though you clearly could have, and so he's basically, appealing to, Jean's better nature. And sure enough, Jean Grey resurfaces, and, she's trying to explain to Scott what's going on. It's like there's this war inside of her, and she's seen things and done things that terrify her, and she knows that, if left unchecked, she's just going to do worse, and she doesn't know how much longer she can, hold back, and Scott's saying, well, remember, you and I, we're together, we will solve this together, we will work together, live or die, we will do it together, and so he's getting through to her, which is when Professor X, who had been present, but had been holding back this whole time, like off in the distance, makes himself known and attacks Jean Grey, using his telepathic abilities. And this causes Jean to swat Scott aside, basically just assuming that Scott was using this as a ruse, because he didn't know Professor X was going to be present and, use his abilities to attack Jean. And so what you have is a battle of wills between, Dark Phoenix, who's in the body of Jean Grey, or is Jean Grey, and is a part of her as well, with all this cosmic ability and might, versus Professor X, the most powerful telepath on the planet. And it's a close call, but Professor X is able to defeat her. And Jean Grey, like Dark Phoenix is dispelled, or dispersed, but Jean Grey, seemingly, but Jean Grey, it's Jean Grey who wakes up, though. And so, the X-Men, I mean, they're overjoyed, and, they're happy that Jean's, returned and, is back and alive. And, they're, happy and wanting to, just take a moment to, appreciate, this hard-won victory. But it's at that point that they're teleported from Earth onto, the Imperial starship that Lilandra is commanding, the Shi'ar starship that she's in charge of. And it's filled with, all these alien ambassadors, as well as her own Imperial Guard, which were a group of, alien beings alien super beings who, act as her protectors. And, basically, she's, brought the X-Men and Jean Grey onto the ship to, hold Jean Grey accountable for what she did as Dark Phoenix, because, the X-Men don't know about, the civilization that she wiped out until Lilandra, shows them proof of this. And at this point, the X-Men are like, oh my God, because they didn't realize, they knew that Dark Phoenix was, dangerous, but they didn't know that she had already done, such a horrendous thing. And Jean Grey, she's terrified because she remembers doing that. Even though she herself is in control now, she remembers doing that as Dark Phoenix. And so, Lilandra is, saying that for the good of the universe, Jean Grey has to die so the Dark Phoenix can't return. And since it's still a part of her, even though Jean Grey's in control, it seems, Dark Phoenix is still a part of her, and as long as there's a chance that the Dark Phoenix can come back, then, you know, the universe is in danger. And so, you know, the X-Men aren't wanting to, you know, turn Jean Grey over to the Shi'ar without a fight, you know, but then Professor X says something to Lilandra in the Shi'ar language and basically challenges her to a duel of honor. And it's the one thing that, you know, the Shi'ar, you know, cannot refuse in their society. And so Lilandra, you know, she's, you know, impressed with how much, you know, Charles was able to, you know, pick up about her civilization in his time with her, you know, and her people. But she's also sad because she knows that, you know, people are going to be hurt and most likely killed because of this. Whereas, you know, if he hadn't thrown the challenge down, you know, she could have just, you know, had her forces overpower the X-Men and hold them back while taking Jean to be executed. And not that she would have taken any pleasure in it, but that would have been the easier option. But because this gauntlet's been thrown down, she has to concede, and so she allows Charles and, you know, and the X-Men, a night to rest and recover, so that way they'll be, you know, ready to battle, you know, the Imperial Guard in the morning. And so the X-Men, you know, they're, you know, in their own individual, you know, private quarters on the ship, and they're recuperating, and they're also thinking, you know, about the situation. And ultimately, you know, they all decide that they're going to fight on behalf of Jean, but some of them are conflicted by it, because on one hand, you know, Jean's one of their own and they all love her, but at the same time, they can't deny the fact that, you know, she's harboring this cosmic entity, or this cosmic entity has become a part of her and she a part of it, and they have, you know, callously wiped out a whole alien civilization. There's all this blood on her hands, and so they're willing to fight for her, but at the same time they're like, you know, shouldn't she, but is it right that she, you know, goes scot-free after this if we win? And so, you know, because basically, you know, according to the terms of the duel, you know, if the X-Men win, then, you know, Lilandra will release, you know, Jean Grey, you know, and the X-Men, you know, from their custody and allow them, you know, to go back to Earth, you know, unharmed. But if the Imperial Guard win, then Jean Grey's life is forfeit, but on the other hand, the X-Men will be allowed to return to Earth unharmed still, but just without Jean Grey. And so the battle ends up being fought on this area of the moon called the Blue Area. And it turns out that, you know, the X-Men don't know this at the time, but this is actually where the Watcher, you know, that big bald dude from What If, you know, makes his home. And so it's like there's all this technology there, so they know that, you know, some civilization had lived there once, or maybe still does live there, but they just don't know where it is or if it's even still alive. But there's a presence of oxygen on the blue area of the moon, so, you know, they'll actually be able to fight on the moon. But if they go past this area, there's no breathable air, so they have to be strategic about where they fight and what have you. Plus, there's the fact that the moon's gravity is different from Earth's gravity. And so the X-Men are teleported down to, you know, the blue area, as are the Imperial Guard, albeit in different parts. And so they split into teams, you know, to, you know, take on the Imperial Guard. And the battle kind of goes back and forth. You know, some of the X-Men are able to take out some of the Imperial Guard and vice versa. But at the end of the day, though, the Imperial Guard basically just, you know, wipes the floor with the X-Men eventually. And this is something that it hurts both Professor X and Lilandra, who are watching from the ship. You know, because, you know, this is something where Professor X is, you know, seeing his beloved students, you know, being hurt and very nearly killed in battle, and he can do nothing but watch. And he also knows that, you know, Jean Grey's life is on the line, and she may well die, you know, this day. And Lilandra, she's watching this, but she's also seeing what it's doing to Charles, and so, she wants to reach out and comfort him, but she can't. As an empress of the Shi'ar Empire, she can't comfort him because she has to be true to her people. And as empress of the Shi'ar Empire, she's charged with the responsibility of ending a threat to the universe. And so it's a very sad moment, but at this point, the only ones of the X-Men that are still left standing are Cyclops and Jean. And so they initially try to retreat and hide for a bit, but then they decide, okay, we're gonna we'll go out fighting and we'll die trying, and so they come out guns blazing, so to speak, as in Cyclops using his optic blasts and Jean using her telekinetic abilities. But unfortunately though, the Dark Phoenix ends up resurfacing, and so Lilandra is preparing to have the Shi'ar, the firepower on the ship rain down on the blue area of the moon, or just to destroy the moon if necessary to kill Jean Grey. And it's at that point that Jean, after she's defeated the Imperial Guard nearly single-handedly, they're attacking her and Scott, she's basically breaking down in tears, telling him that it's too late, and there's only one way this can end, where the universe has hope. And she uses her power to reconstruct this alien weapon that was laying around on the moon, and uses it to destroy herself. And so thus the battle ends, and the threat to the universe is dealt with, but just in a very horrible, tragic way. And so the next story, it's the aftermath of that, where we have the funeral of Jean Grey, and we also have Scott Summers just basically reflecting on things. And in the process, the readers are kind of caught up on what's been going on with the X-Men at this point, or up to this point. And so fairly new readers can get a sense of the history that's gone on with the books up to this point in time. And he ends up, after the funeral's over, he decides to take a leave of absence from the X-Men because, he's just broken. And so, Professor X and the others, they understand, and, they say their heartfelt goodbyes to him. And Lilandra is also attending the funeral, but, before she goes to Jean's family and, gives them offers them a gift. And it's this globe that has like this sort of holographic imagery of Jean Grey, but it also has a fragment of her, essence. So basically, if the family, ever wants to, remember Jean, or just, feel her, basically all they have to do is, hold the globe, and, and an imagery of her will appear, and it'll be like she's right there with them, and hopefully it can help them to get through their grief. And so basically it's a very bittersweet gift under the circumstances, but they accept the gift and they thank her, and so she leaves, and so does Scott. But while Scott departs from the X-Men, Kitty Pryde finally arrives at Westchester Mansion, where the X-Men are housed, and so this begins her membership of or her time with the team. So the next storyline is a two-parter, wherein we have not only Kitty Pryde becoming more acclimated with the other X-Men, but also trying to say have a life outside the X-Men as well. And we're introduced to this character named, I think her name was Stevie Hunter, and she was like a former ballet dancer, but due to an accident, she can't, take the stage anymore. But she runs like this, dance studio, and Aurora, Storm, she takes Kitty to the studio, so that way, she can have an extracurricular activity to do, something that doesn't involve, being an X-Men or, trained just for the, the sake of, honing your mutant abilities. Like she wants, Kitty to still be able to have a semblance of a childhood, but in the meantime, though, Wolverine talks with the other X-Men and explains to him that, he's going to go back to Canada to try and make things right with, Alpha Flight, and hopefully get off the hook with the Canadian government. And so, because this whole thing is, it's something he's been struggling with for a while, and he knows he needs to deal with it. But, this whole, thing with, Jean Grey making the ultimate sacrifice, as well as, Scott, being in a place where he knows that he needs to leave the team and just, work on himself. It's kind of gotten to Wolverine to where it's like, okay, I need to take accountability for things on my end. And so when he lets him know that he's going to Canada, Nightcrawler offers to join him, because at this point, like, they're kind of best buds. And, plus the fact that Nightcrawler kind of wants to see some of the other members of the Alpha Flight, from last time, because, there was kind of like this curious, frenemy, vibe that they had with them. But they get to Canada, and when they find James, he's working with Shaman and Aurora, because it turns out that there's this series of murders that have happened in the Canadian wilderness, and they're trying to find out who or what this killer is. And the timing of Wolverine and Nightcrawler's arrival is very fortuitous. And Wolverine, he's looking through the evidence, and he realizes that the murderer is something that he's encountered before, and it's the Wendigo, which he encountered way back in his first appearance in The Incredible Hulk. And he explains what the Wendigo is, and the Wendigo was, it was once a man, like once an ordinary man, but much like the Native American folklore says about the Wendigo, this man had been stranded in the wilderness with his comrades, and as they had died, he was starving, and he was reduced to eating the bodies of his friends. And once he did that, this caused the curse of the Wendigo to come upon him, and he turned from man to a wild beast. And so the Wendigo has been preying on civilians in the area, and at this point there's two civilians that they're trying to find because they're convinced that, or Alpha Flight's trying to find because they're convinced that they're still alive. And it was like this mother and there was this mother and daughter who were kidnapped by the Wendigo. And while they found the bloody remains of the father, and they were able to they were initially able to figure out what happened to the family, because there's a son who was with them, but he just barely escaped with his life. And after telling his story to the authorities, kind of went catatonic. And so just based on what he saw, and plus the fact that they couldn't find any signs of the mother and daughter being dead, there's a chance that the Wendigo is kind of keeping them around for a snack. And so time is of the essence. And so Wolverine and Nightcrawler, they offer to help Guardian, Aurora, and Shaman to help capture Wendigo. And Wolverine's saying that hey, and maybe we can work things out after this, as far as, there being peace between, him and Alpha Flight, and therefore the Canadian government as well. And so, unfortunately, though, the Wendigo finds them before they can find it. And, they end up fighting it. And the Wendigo has this, massive regenerative ability that puts Wolverine's to shame, which is one of the reasons why he was able to go up against someone as tough as the Hulk, back in, Wolverine's first appearance. But ultimately, it's Aurora who ends up saving the day, because one of the things that she turns into is, well, a Wolverine, and literally tears out the Wendigo's throat. And of course, I mean, you don't see it, but it's described. So, excuse me. But unfortunately, though, one of the side effects of Aurora turning into an animal as wild as something as the Wolverine is that, she risks being stuck in that form because she's, tempted to give in to the animal mindset. And so Wolverine, of all people, ends up, coaxing her back out and, basically reassuring her that, she's still human, or she's still a person. She's not an animal. And sure enough, this gradually, allows for Aurora to come back to the surface and turn from a Wolverine back to her normal self. And so this is something that actually gives her a newfound amount of respect for Wolverine, because while she was a part of Alpha Flight, as Wolverine had been, the two of them had never actually worked together, or until this particular instance. And the fact that Wolverine was the one who was able to help her, come back to the surface and basically save her life, to keep her from, being stuck as an animal. I mean, it's something that, she's always going to be grateful to him for. And, she understands why, because initially she was resentful of Wolverine because she didn't understand why, James, and the Canadian government was so dead set on getting Wolverine back. Like, she understood the history, but she didn't understand why they were seemingly obsessed with having him on the team. But after having Wolverine save her, she understands that there's a lot more to Wolverine than just savagery. Like, there's like this primal, connection with nature almost that, was ultimately her salvation. And so she wishes that Wolverine were on the team with them, but she also understands that Wolverine's his own man. And as a result, he's best doing what he wants to do, as far as whether he joins the X-Men or comes back to Alpha Flight. And so after this, Wolverine and James make peace, and while this is going on, Shaman enacts this elaborate ritual that transforms the Wendigo back into the human he once was. And unfortunately, though, the said guy is arrested, or placed under arrest, for having committed all those murders. Now, granted, I mean, he did so while he was a monster, but at the same time, he had put himself in a position to where he had turned into the Wendigo as the story went. And so he's turned over to the authorities, and James basically says that he and Wolverine and the others are good now, and and he'll put in a good word with the Canadian government, but he can basically guarantee that the Canadian government's going to back off and stop going after Wolverine now, because he's going to make it clear that without Wolverine's help, they wouldn't have saved the mother and daughter, that was very much at risk of being killed by the Wendigo. And also, without Wolverine's help, they wouldn't have been able to save Aurora. And so, I'm sorry, Snowbird. Yeah, I'm hoping that I haven't been calling Snowbird Aurora this whole time. If I have, I apologize in advance. But I get caught up in this whole thing. But basically, because Wolverine helped save Snowbird and also helped Alpha Flight to save the mother and daughter from the Wendigo, and thus in the, grave threat to the Canadian wilderness, James reassures Wolverine that, hey, you're okay. The government's not going to come after you anymore. But so while Wolverine and Nightcrawler, leave Canada peacefully and on good terms with Alpha Flight sadly finds out, after this, that their government funding has been cut, because the public's, not too keen on having, superheroes, hogging the limelight and and basically, risking conflict with supervillains and what have you. So, while one chapter ends with them, another will shortly begin because they eventually get their own series. But, okay, so the last couple of stories in here are rather important because you have Days of Future Past, which involves a dystopian future wherein the Sentinels have taken over the world, and the X-Men are, and all the X-Men and mutants in the world have either been killed or put into concentration camps, and the last remaining group of the X-Men in one of these concentration camps, they enact a desperate scheme to send the consciousness of one of them back down in time to the then present, to help the X-Men in that time stop an assassination that would result in this grim future. But in this particular timeline, though, you have the last few remaining X-Men are ironically Magneto of all people, who had at some point had his legs crushed and is, much like Professor X had been, confined to a wheelchair. And you have Colossus, Storm, and Wolverine, and Wolverine at this point isn't, in the concentration camp. He's a member of the Canadian Resistance, but, he does rendezvous with the team, to help them out. But you also have Kitty Pryde, who is a full-grown adult and has been worn down by tragedy. And then you also have the characters of Franklin Richards, the son of Reed and Sue Richards, and you have the new character of Rachel Summers, and the daughter of Scott Summers. And so she's a telepath, and she's going to help Kitty Pryde go down the line. Like they're going to use a machine that they're able to scavenge parts for in secret, and this machine will work in tandem with Rachel Summers' telepathic abilities to send Kitty Pryde's consciousness back in time, to the early 1980s, wherein this assassination would happen. And so they do so successfully, but very much aware that if Kitty Pryde is able to get the information to the X-Men, and the X-Men are able to prevent this assassination, this could result in the whole timeline being wiped out, and thus them wiped out as well. But they think it's worth it to prevent this dark future. So they succeed in sending Kitty Pryde down the line, and her consciousness takes over her younger self, and she's able to tell the X-Men who she is and where she comes from, and Professor X confirms that she's telling the truth. And so this assassination is going to take place, and the target is one Senator Robert Kelly, and the assassination is going to be done by mutants that are tired of humanity persecuting them, and they don't believe in, say, peaceful coexistence. They think it's violence can only be answered with violence. And so this one assassination kickstarts the public's hatred as a whole against mutants, and this in turn allows for the Sentinels to be put back into being constructed, and this unfortunately will result in the Sentinels seeing not only mutants as the enemy, but humans as the enemy as well. Thus, they end up taking over the world. But so it alternates between, the future and the quote unquote past, or our present. And unfortunately, in the future, all the X-Men end up getting killed, with the exception of Rachel Summers, and by the Sentinels, I mean. And it's a very, tragic event, for sure, because it's like these are characters that these last few ones that we've seen are, some of them are, characters that we've grown to, care about over these several issues, and seeing them in these, haggard elderly forms, trying to go out, in one last fight against the Sentinels. They don't go out alone, but unfortunately they all get killed. And so Rachel is left, holding, Kitty Pryde's comatose body, not knowing, whether or not she'll succeed, but everyone else is dead. And so in the present, though, the X-Men, they're able to prevent this assassination, which was being conducted by the newly formed Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, consisting of Mystique, who is a shapeshifter, and also Destiny, who is a blind precog. Like, she's able to see the future. I mean, she's blind, but she can see the future. But due to the presence of the older Kitty Pryde's consciousness being in the body of the younger Kitty Pryde, this results in a distortion that prevents Destiny from seeing how things will turn out. And so this makes it to where she was initially sure of their success in assassinating Robert Kelly, but now she can't tell for sure if they're going to succeed. But you also have Blob, Pyro, and Avalanche, and these characters make up the newly formed Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. But the X-Men are able to defeat them and save Robert Kelly. And unfortunately, though, this seems to be for naught, because Robert Kelly, you'd think he'd be grateful for being saved from assassination, but instead he actually works to bring the Sentinels back into construction. And it turns out that one of the people that he's friends with is Sebastian Shaw, of all people. And Sebastian, of course, is covertly a mutant at this point, but he's wanting to use his resources to kind of get in on what the New World power is going to be. Even if the Sentinels are going to hunt mutants, he wants to be one of the movers and shakers, and so he pretends to be just an ordinary human who happens to be friends with Robert Kelly. And so he's very adamant about helping him get the Sentinels back online. So it's starting to look like this dark future may well come to pass. So the next to last story in this volume focuses on Kitty Pryde, and after she's recovered from this particular adventure wherein she was she was basically out of her own body elsewhere, when she was under the control of the consciousness of her older self, but she's able to recover okay, and in time for Christmas. And so she ends up having the whole mansion to herself, because the other X-Men are basically going out on the town, but Kitty's mature enough to where she's able to have the place to herself. But unfortunately, though, this is a time where this demon, a member of this race called the Nagari, I believe, was a remnant of a race of demons that the X-Men had fought back in Volume 1 in one of the issues. And basically this object of power, this pillar which acted as kind of like this barrier between our reality and the demons, had been destroyed, but the X-Men had been able to defeat the demonic forces and seemingly seal the barrier. But it turns out, though, that over time the Nagari demons had been basically trying to get through and it took quite some time, like a few years even, but eventually, one of them was able to come through, from their dimension into our dimension. And this particular Nagari demon kind of goes on a killing spree and murders a few civilians near where Westchester Mansion is. And it senses that Kitty Pryde is in the mansion, and it's wanting to take revenge on all of the X-Men because it senses that all the X-Men were the ones that defeated, those who, came before him. But it breaks into the mansion and basically just literally leaves, decay and destruction in its wake. And, Kitty is, having to work overtime, to, escape it. Like, she's having to push herself to the limits of her abilities of going through walls and ceilings and everything. And much to her horror, whenever the Nagari makes contact, like, usually something tries to hit her in her tangible form, it goes right through her. But one of its claws manages to cut her arm, even in her intangible form, and basically, leaves it, numb, and she's unable to use this arm. And so she, she makes it to the danger room and tries to, pump up, the difficulty levels, and hit the Nagari demon with everything she can think of. And it's a delaying tactic at best, but she takes one of the underground tram cars, to where the Blackbird plane is being held. And once she gets on board, she knows that the Nagari demon's going to come, right after her because it's gone through every defensive barrier that, she can whip up. And she's ultimately able to use the exhaust from the plane's jet engines, to, burn the demon to death. And thankfully, she had been, studying to, in some of her school sessions, with Xavier, that was one of the things that she had been studying, like the operating system of the Blackbird. Thankfully, that came in handy. And she, uses, her, her training to, get the bird up and running and thus fry the Nagari demon. And so when the X-Men come back home, from their, Christmas excursions that night, they're like, what the hell happened here? And so, Kitty's having to explain to them, what's going on and what happened. And so, I mean, naturally they're terrified that, they had inadvertently left her all alone against this, demonic creature, but, and they don't quite know for sure, where it came from or anything like that. I mean, we, the readers, did, but they don't. But they're very thankful that she's alive. And so, the story ends, with the revelation that, it had still come charging at her, from the fire, but then it just, turned to ashes. And so basically, Kitty Pryde has, passed her, exam and is now worth being a member of the team. And so the final issue in this volume focuses on Cyclops, when he's by himself and basically trying to deal with things on an emotional level. And he makes the acquaintance of this woman named Colleen Wing, and she runs runs this ship, on the sea, and he hires on as a member of the crew. But the two of them ultimately end up coming across this demonic entity named Despair, who is actually an enemy of the supernatural character Man-Thing. But ultimately Cyclops has to work with Colleen Wing to fight through Despair's manipulations, and ultimately Man-Thing who gets involved in the story ends up helping them out to defeat Despair, and thus driving Despair away and depriving him of the satisfaction of breaking someone like Cyclops. But that's how, the whole, collection ends. So, okay, all right, I've already gone over, all the stories in here. I mean, a lot to cover and everything, but okay, this was an excellent collection, and I just think that, all the stories in here, with the exception of the very last one, flowed into one another naturally. And I think that, all the characters are written well, and, the stories, I mean, they still stand the test of time, even though they were written in the late 70s, early 80s. I mean, we end up getting drawn in. The action's exciting. The artwork by John Byrne is amazing, and the dialogue by Chris Claremont, I mean, it for each of the characters, I mean, it's unique. And so none of the characters sound the same. Like, they all have their own voices. And, when bad things happen to some of these characters, we feel it, we care. And especially with, the loss of Jean Grey at this point. And, the Dark Phoenix saga is definitely one of those tragic stories in the X-Men, series. And, yeah, it just still stands the test of time. I mean, there are certain, developments that, came into play later on in this series, which changed a lot of things. But at this point in time, though, Jean Grey's death was very much a real thing. And the team was left reeling, from the loss of her. But I think that it would have been great if, say, this particular, collection had ended, with the story, focusing on Kitty Pryde, going, up against that remnant from the Nagari demons. I think that it would have been a nice bookend, because it turns out that that was actually the very last issue that John Byrne worked on the book, and it would have been the perfect ending point, for this particular collection, because, it has, several of the, stories that he worked on with writer Chris Claremont, in developing, these, classic tales that, still, are regarded as some of the best X-Men stories ever told. And, this story focusing on Kitty Pryde, I mean, we see this character who was, kind of like a neophyte, being shown proving herself, as a worthy member of the team, just by her ingenuity, and also surviving too. So, and I just think that that would have been a good way to end the book. But I think that the story with Cyclops, at the end, where, he goes up against despair, I feel like that was just kind of like a random, I felt like its inclusion in this volume felt random. I think it would have made more sense to have it be the start of volume 3, because, I mean, once again, this is coming off of the very successful, run of John Byrne. And nothing against Brent Anderson, he's a very good artist, but in terms of, say, look and tone, it very much, was kind of at odds with, the artwork that John Byrne had, as well as the tone of the stories that Chris Claremont had. And I do like the character of Colleen Wing. I mean, she and, Scott Summers had very good chemistry with one another, and you could tell that there's like a budding, friendship / possible romance, in the wings between the two of them. But it felt natural, though, and she was a very likable character and a very, caring character. And, her friendship with Scott was believable. It just felt like that. The story itself, though, just felt very much Monster of the Week. And not to say that Monster of the Week stories are bad. I mean, oftentimes they could be very good and fun. It's just that the fact that this was used as the very last story in this volume felt very much out of place. And I just think that had it been thrown in, used as, like, say, the start of volume 3, it would have, made much more sense. And had the Kitty Pryde story, the solo story, be the final story in this volume, that would have been a nice, little coda, as it were. But from the beginning of this volume, like from the, introduction of Alpha Flight, up to the solo Kitty Pryde story, I mean, you have like comic book perfection. I mean, you have, exceptional writing by Chris Claremont and exceptional artwork by John Byrne, and the two of them just work together beautifully. And, just for that alone, I mean, just to have, this particular set of stories, collected in one volume, I would say, Essential X-Men Volume 2 is definitely worth picking up and worth having. And also the fact that, the reprints are in black and white, it allows you to further appreciate the artwork, on hand. But I will say that I think it maybe depends on which edition of Essential X-Men Volume 2 you get, because there's at least one instance, wherein, the final page in one of the stories is missing. And I don't know what was going on there, because, basically there's this revelation that kind of comes into play much later on in the series, but that particular revelation is missing from this book. And it's not like the page was torn out or anything, but it's just the book omits that particular passage for some reason. So I don't know if it was like a printing error or what, but just be aware of that. Like there are a couple instances where like the manufacturer, might have fudged something as far as, an absence of dialogue or something like that. But other than that, though, I mean, I would say that this is a great collection, and it's, a great way to, get the stories, especially this particular line of stories, for the X-Men, because, I mean, as I mentioned, I mean, having the Proteus saga, lead up to the Dark Phoenix saga, I mean, you have two of the best X-Men stories back to back, and, several other great stories, surrounding them. So, X-Men, Essential X-Men Volume 2, I'm going to go ahead and give 5 out of 5 stars to. Great set of stories, further development of some, very good characters, and it was wonderful, seeing them, further gel as a team, and, just grow as characters. And, yeah, it's sad that, John Byrne left the series at this point, but I think he definitely left on a high note, because, I mean, he had a hand in, coming up with, some of the best X-Men stories ever told. And so, I mean, at the very least, I mean, the story he left on was a point where, it's still, regarded as one of the great X-Men stories. So thank you very much for, taking the time to check out my review. Yeah, I know it's a lot. I mean, there was a lot to go over, as far as, the stories and everything, but it's just, there was a lot to convey, I think. But, yeah, I appreciate y'all bearing with me and listening in, and I'll put the link to Volume 1 in the description for this review, so that way, if y'all want to see my take on that one, you're more than welcome to. But, if you made it this far, thanks for listening, and thanks for taking the time. And got any questions, comments, feedback, I'd love to hear it. So y'all take care, have a good night, bye.